It's been 2 years since the worst of the coronavirus pandemic, but much like it is with long COVID, where patients complain of symptoms even after the virus has run its course, Africa's aviation sector is battling to recover to pre-pandemic levels. The sustained and significant loss of revenue endured by all airlines on the continent during the period left them vulnerable to economic headwinds that 2022 has brought. Jet fuel prices are 38% higher than they were in 2021. With air traffic on the continent at 66% of pre-COVID levels, revenues have come under pressure, driving many airlines to the brink of bankruptcy, and a few, like Eswatini Airlink, AB Aviation, and Tolulope into liquidation. However, the terrible economy is only one reason for the weak performance of Africa's aviation sector. Even before the pandemic, the sector was feeling the pressure. Only 2 of Africa's 10 most well-known airlines, Ethiopian Airlines and Royal Air Maroc, have remained positive in operating margins in the last 10 years. In these tough times, more African countries are exploring collaboration, with some pulling resources together to keep their flags flying high. Seun Mendis, aviation consultant, joins me now as we look at African aviation in 2022 and a bit of projections for the new year coming. Seun, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me today again.
Thanks for having me.
So we know that COVID-19, for all intents and purposes, basically decimated the African airline aviation industry. The World Bank said that African countries spent about $4 billion to bail out their airlines, and the Africa Airlines Association said that airlines have now recovered about 76% of their capacity in 2019, and traffic is back to about 66% of pre-COVID levels. But in terms of management, and that's a conversation I've had with many aviation consultants throughout this year, what could African countries have done better to sort of manage the fallout of COVID-19 and then the resultant attempt to recover?
That's a very good question. And I think that a lot of the problems that African aviation faced were not things that African countries themselves could really have avoided. I think Africa managed the pandemic a lot better than a lot of other continents did as a whole. There were less lockdowns, more common sense measures rather than knee-jerk reactions. But unfortunately, as part of a globalized industry in aviation, Africa fell victim to what was effectively a knee-jerk reaction at the peak southern summer season last year when the Omicron variant came out, and a lot of African countries wound up on a blacklist. And so just as the recovery was beginning to take hold, Africa was blacklisted and people could no longer travel to Africa, vacations were canceled and so forth. And I think that was really where African aviation took a huge hit at the end of 2021 and leading into the first quarter of 2022. So that is something that, I don't think African airlines or African governments could have really done much about. That said, African governments also do carry a lot of blame for the slower than expected recovery in Africa relative to other regions. And I think a big reason for this is that African governments have continued to take the view that they need to protect their national favorites, whether that's a national airline or a preferred airline in their country, rather than supporting the industry as a whole. Let's just take 2 examples here. If you look at South Africa, the South African government has thrown good money after bad to prop up carriers like South African Airways, which were on the brink of failure before COVID anyway. And the expenses that they've thrown into that have not just kept what was a bankrupt airline alive, but has also then steered the market in a way that allowed previously profitable private airlines like Comair or Kulula to fail. In Nigeria, you've seen the government spend most of the year, going on and spending a lot of money in attempting to establish their new national airline, and not as much money in terms of supporting the existing carriers, whether that is in terms of supply of jet fuel, which has been a big issue during the year in Nigeria, whether it's been in terms of foreign exchange availability for both Nigerian and international carriers operating in Nigeria. All these basics for the industry, which needs government intervention or at least government support, have been ignored at the risk of supporting pet projects, which often are just black holes where government or taxpayer funds wind up disappearing into.
And so that's an interesting point you make, especially given the fact that, as you said, these sort of issues existed pre-pandemic. And I want to quickly touch on that. There are also issues with economic regulation, in fact, as you've mentioned, being more anti-competitive, but the person you're protecting is really not adding as much as you would want to your industry. Profitability, safety, security, sustainable financing as well, because of critical infrastructure situations. We've had 2 years after the pandemic, and we're starting to move away from that. But these issues still exist. Was there even really any attempt in the past 1 year for some of the major aviation hubs to truly deal with some of these critical problems that they face, even beyond before the pandemic?
Well, to be fair, there really hasn't been a huge amount of change. The people that were doing things badly or doing things trending in the wrong direction pre-pandemic continue to trend in that direction. But those who were doing things right before the pandemic are continuing to improve. You touched upon economic regulation. I think one thing which has been in the news lately has been the SATAM, or the single African air transport market. Now, there's been one very big change there, which is that the African Civil Aviation Commission in Dakar, which for the last 35 years since the Yamoussoukro Declaration and through the Yamoussoukro decision and its rebranding as SATAM, has effectively done very little to implement this African open skies and an African common market for aviation. That's changed during 2022 because they've got a new Secretary General, and she's got a background from the private sector. It's a Nigerian lady, Funke Adeyemi, and you've already begun to see that AFCAC is beginning to get a bit more momentum in terms of getting states to commit more to implementing the SATAM and the African open skies. So that's a very positive sign in that respect, that at least we're beginning to see some momentum from an agency that effectively has stagnated and wasted opportunities for the last 30 years plus. But other than that, the airlines like Ethiopian, which were well run during the pandemic, ran themselves very well and professionally during the pandemic, and have emerged on the other side of the pandemic with greater opportunities, as their weaker competitors who didn't make the right decisions both pre and during pandemic are dropping out or cutting back, leaving more opportunity for well-run airlines like Ethiopian to continue their growth at an expedited pace.
Very true. And I think Ethiopian will probably be one of your winners for this year. But Sean, let's look at something. So you did mention Nigeria earlier, and I have to expand this conversation because Nigeria has come under fire for withholding money owed to international airlines that fly to and from the country. In fact, Nigeria tops the list of countries that the International Air Transport Association says are withholding funds. Now, total blocked funds globally hit $2 billion this year, with Nigeria now holding about $550 million back. Algeria is the other African country in the top 5. So Nigeria happens to be one of the major aviation hubs on the African continent. In terms of that, the impact of withholding these funds that should be repatriated, what was the impact on the larger African aviation space?
Well, as you said, Nigeria is the largest example of this, as is Algeria, but there are a number of other African countries, Ethiopia, Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, Malawi, which are all in similar situations, but are not getting as much attention since, the total amount of funds tied up over there are not the headlining multi-hundred million dollars, such as in Nigeria. The reality is, doing this winds up cutting off these countries from the global economy. Initially, you'll wind up with airlines restricting sales, but subsequently you'll find airlines actually pulling out. And you've seen this happen in Nigeria already. Emirates Airlines has had a much publicized initial cutback of flights, then suspension of flights, and reinstatement, and now a complete pullout of Nigeria after promises from the government of Nigeria to make foreign exchange available to them to repatriate funds did not materialize. Other airlines in Nigeria have reduced their schedule, largely because of these issues. Fares wind up going up because airlines have to charge higher than published exchange rates, simply because they're winding up having to purchase foreign exchange either through gray market instruments or through more creative swaps and exchanges in order to get their currency repatriated. In other places, like I'll give you an example in Malawi, Kenya Airways, one of the major airlines flying to Malawi, has suspended local sales there. If you want to buy a Kenya Airways ticket originating in Malawi, you're going to need to buy it on their website and pay for it in Kenya shillings or US dollars. Ethiopian Airlines has levied a 15% surcharge on any tickets that originate in Malawi. So, governments may think that they're trying to boost their economy overall by making it hard to access foreign exchange for airlines. But number one, they tend to be often ignoring the treaty commitments that they made in their bilateral air service agreements, which guarantees repatriation of funds on a bilateral basis. And secondly, they wind up essentially making it harder and more expensive for their own citizens to travel, for their own goods to be exported, and generally depress their economy. So that's never a good thing.
So let's look at your winners and losers. You've mentioned Ethiopian, and we saw how they pivoted in terms of moving towards the cargo traffic. And that's something that not everybody was able to successfully do, but it's been a line of business that Ethiopian says they're now looking to expand. We've talked about South African Airways this year as well. Kenya Airways continues to have an issue looking for yet more bailouts from the government as well. Nigeria Air has failed to take to the skies in 2022. We might hopefully see that happen in 2023. But when we look at the winners and the losers, just top three winners, top three losers of this year. Sean, tell me who they are for you.
Winner in African aviation year after year is going to be Ethiopian Airlines. I mean, they've had their own challenges in addition to COVID with the with conflict in the Tigray region over there, but they have come through with flying colors. They've also had a leadership change in 2022 with their long-serving CEO, Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun, retiring for health reasons, and it's all been seamless. The airline continues to move forward as a juggernaut, and it's definitely the number one winner in Africa for 2022. Another airline which has done extremely well in 2022 is a regional airline in South Africa called Airlink. And, Airlink's not a very glamorous airline. They fly regional jets. Their largest aircraft is just about a 100-seater. But what they've done is they've taken advantage of South African Airways' cutbacks. And they used to be a partner of South African Airways. They've gone independent during the pandemic. And once again, they've been able to add a lot of aircraft. They've been able to add new routes and have really solidified themselves as one of the leading carriers in South Africa, if not the leading carrier in South Africa. And my third winner, again from Africa, will be, again, looking at South Africa, which is Fly Safair. They are a low-cost carrier, primarily focused on domestic operations there. But once again, with the exit of BA, Comair, Kalula, the entire brand from the market, as well as South African Airways' own cutbacks and Mango's current business rescue process, they found a huge opportunity for the domestic market in South Africa to be captured by them. And they've added, I lose track. They've almost doubled their fleet in 2022 and are continuing to add aircraft literally on a monthly basis. So I think Ethiopian, Airlink, and Safair, I'd say, were probably the three biggest winners in African aviation by doing the right thing and taking advantage of the right opportunities at the right time.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to losers,
yes.
I think for the most part, African airlines that have overly relied on state bailouts or state support or state-dictated strategic plans have been the biggest losers. And, you could probably start with South African Airways on that front. The airline restarted their operations in 2021 after over a year of being grounded, first due to their business rescue and then due to COVID. But despite all their plans to take on a strategic investor in the Takatso consortium, I remember when it first was announced in June of 2021, they said the whole thing would be done by August. Well, August 2021 has passed, August 2022 has passed, and August 2023 is going to be on us soon. And we still haven't seen much progress on that front. And I think, South African Airways is stuck in a bit of a limbo as a result of this. The government needs to make the commitments to strategic partner or to liquidate it, because they cannot go on just, throwing more taxpayer funds at this. Another big loser in 2022 is another government-owned airline, and I'd say that's going to be Air Senegal. This is the fifth attempt at a national airline in the last 25 years in Senegal, starting with Air Afrique through Air Senegal International, et cetera, et cetera. And this airline, too, took a lot of flashy new planes and so forth. But once again, in the middle of this year, they wound up having to dismiss almost their entire management team, bring in a whole new government-appointed slate of directors, take a large government bailout, and effectively, re-examine their entire strategic plan for that airline. Again, this was partly a case of the COVID pandemic, but I think also a case of a government-dictated expansion strategy, which quite simply did not reflect market realities. And if we go into a third loser, I'm going to actually name a carrier that doesn't yet exist, and that is the new national airline of Nigeria, Nigeria Air.
Sean, how does Nigeria Air make the losers list ahead of Kenya Airways?
Well, you know why, and the reason for that is because Nigeria Air is not actually a new airline. It's an airline that we've
Yes.
been hearing about for many years, both as Air Nigeria, Nigeria Eagle, Nigeria, and so forth. And while they use the term Nigeria Eagle, I like to call it Nigeria Ostrich because it makes a lot of noise, it runs around, but it's never going to fly. And unfortunately, this year, there's too much of the focus in the aviation industry in Nigeria. In fact, all of West Africa has been on this pet project of a minister rather than something that the market necessarily needs, and that has been to the detriment of the entire Nigerian aviation industry. And you've seen lawsuits, you've seen protests, you've seen everything around it, and Nigerian aviation is poorer for it than it would have been if this project had not been pursued with the amount of resources that could not really be spared by the industry for that. So I would name Nigerian aviation as a result of Nigeria Air as one of the biggest losers in African aviation for 2022.
When you said Nigerian ostrich, I just felt my heart and probably hundreds of hearts probably break as well. But Seun, ostriches are the flightless birds of the world and they don't fly. So please, we're going to have to change that name. Nigeria Air must fly in 2023. All right, Seun, so stick with me on this as we look to 2023 now. So some are saying that we're seeing now a liberalization of the African aviation space with a few interesting things that have been happening in the past few weeks. So one, Kenya Airways and South African Airways, Kenya Airways did not make your losers list, recently signed a code-share agreement as the two African carriers begin to deepen commercial ties. That's interesting because those are two very troubled carriers coming together. Are they creating trouble or are they going to create magic? Then secondly, about 15 African countries, at this point now I think it's 34, I beg your pardon, have begun to implement the single African air transport market. A study by the African Union said the potential benefits of the markets include member states gaining an additional $4.2 billion in GDP, over 596,000 new jobs, and 27% reduction in airfares. But you said something earlier when we were talking about the Nigeria situation and repatriation of funds across the continent. If we're having African airlines taking some of the steps they're taking because of repatriation issues, doesn't that put the single Africa air transport market into question, even though it's a good thing? 34 countries are on board now. What do you think the benefits of all of this will be? And I should also ask that Ethiopian said they're adding more aircraft and they hope to expand their fleet by over 100 aircraft, I think by 2024 or 2025, thereabouts. So what do you think these three things primarily are going to do for the aviation space in 2023 as we wrap up?
Well, you say 34 countries have signed up to it, and that is true. 34 countries have put pen to paper. But unfortunately, as you also mentioned, only 15 of these countries have actually begun implementing it. The other 19 countries are paying lip service to it and are trying to get the benefits of said single market without necessarily providing the reciprocal benefits to other airlines. So I think, they need to be called out on it. And I'm hopeful that the African Civil Aviation Commission, which is the executing agency for the single African air transport market, will be able to actually name and shame these countries which are not fully embracing the principles of SATAM while taking advantage. And I'll name two countries right here. Cote d'Ivoire is one of them. They're very happy to take advantage of traffic rights in the other African countries that they fly to. But if you're trying to get a license to operate in Cote d'Ivoire as another African carrier, it's a very difficult process. Kenya is another one which is a bit hypocritical on this front. They like Kenya Airways to have advantage of flying to many of these countries, but again, make it very difficult for foreign carriers to get licenses to operate in Kenya. So I'll name those two, but there are a number of other African countries which need to step up and live up to the commitments that they have made. And yes, there are policies like the inability to repatriate funds by government subsidies to African airlines. When you have a single market, you cannot have some players in that market who are competing with privately funded or non-government subsidized players to continue to operate below cost. Rwanda is an example of that. Their annual operating budget includes between 150 to 200 million euros every year of government support, and yet these carriers go head to head with the private carriers and with the non-government subsidized carriers in Africa, and it makes it very difficult for those carriers to compete on an actual commercial basis. So these are the things which need to change, and which when governments live up to the terms that they've agreed to under the single African air transport market, these will change, and that's where we're hopeful that in 2023 and beyond we'll see more and more governments actually putting the money where their mouth is and not the money into never-ending pits of airlines that are constantly on the verge of bankruptcy.
Unfortunately, constantly on the verge of bankruptcy might be where we have to wrap up. I'll just quickly sneak this in, Sean. 2023 is just a few days away. Your quick outlook, but I know we'll be talking to you particularly as we expand the conversation on the single Africa air transport market. But in terms of what you project for the aviation industry in Africa in 2023.
We'll definitely see an improvement in growth over what we saw in 2022. As I mentioned, the first quarter of 2022 was pretty much a write-off due to the Omicron variant. We're hopefully not going to see another black swan event like that. So 2023 will see 4 quarters of consistent growth. I expect to see that by the end of 2023, we'll be close to about 90 to 95% of capacity in 2019, with moving into 2024 to begin seeing actual growth for the first time in almost 5 years. So it's blue skies ahead for African Airlines. Who the winners and losers in 2023 will be is to be determined, but I expect that the industry as a whole will continue to grow well and will continue to build upon the strong foundations of safety and which are so critical and which have been so important in African aviation's renaissance over the last 2 decades.
All right, Seun Mendis, thank you as always. I'm still feeling that Nigeria ostrich comment. I'm going to hold it to my heart. You're going to have to find a way to let it go in 2023, but thank you as always for your time.
Thank you.